So in this video, I'm going to be talking about techniques and tips for helping your toddler fall asleep in their bed on their own and stay asleep all night. So in the first part of my Toddler Sleep series, which I'll link below, I talk all about the typical steps that I make to help a toddler get to the point that you can start teaching them to fall asleep on their own. So all those little kind of tips that can help the process go a little smoother. So when you go to make the change, it will be easier and it'll work. So I really suggest checking out that video, which I'll link below, before you start doing any of these changes I suggest, just to make it, again, go a little bit smoother for you. And I really do find that all those changes are the key to success. So in this video, we'll talk about, okay, once you get to that point, so you've done any little changes, you're ready to have your toddler start falling asleep on their own. How do we go about doing that? And I'll talk more specifically about three different, kind of like the big three components when we're talking through, about what are we going to do this? What are the three things I always talk about with parents and the three things that are always part of our plan to make that happen? So I'm going to be talking about those, and then I also am going to explain two of the most popular techniques I use, the ones I find work really well, and I'll talk about them and how the three kind of main philosophies or things we talk about will apply to those techniques specifically. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to toddler sleep, I find that there's so many options in what works for toddlers and in what you can do. Toddlers, once they get old enough and they're sleeping in their own bed, usually we can use some kind of communication with them. We can use imagination, and there's just the amount of options just opens up. So I don't want you to feel like this is the only thing that you can do, your only option, because there's tons of them. I just want to communicate some of the things I commonly do, some things to think about, so that it might help you think of what you can do for your little one. But keep in mind that there's lots of options, and it doesn't have to be these two specific techniques, but they are ones that I find can work pretty well. So yeah, there's a lot of variability in my plans for toddlers, and it's hard to communicate that in a short video. So instead, I'll give you an idea of, like I said, the main philosophies, main things we think about, the components of a plan, and then some examples of how that could work possibly for you. But it doesn't have to be your way. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about primarily at bedtime. So the goal of having them fall asleep on their own at bedtime. And this is the goal that most people come to me with toddlers, is how can I get them to fall asleep easier on their own in their room? Most parents, by the end of the night, they don't want, bedtime to be an hour and a half process. They want it to be a happy time. They want it to be easy, and they want the toddler to learn to be, comfortable sleeping. And what's interesting is, if you're having a toddler that's having sleep difficulty kind of at any point, I find when you work on bedtime, the rest of the night just gets easier. So once we get a toddler comfortable sleeping, happy to sleep initially when they go to bed, usually the rest of the night just kind of falls into place. So the work that I do with toddlers, most of our energy and part of the plan is bedtime. So that's why I'll be focusing on it, in this talk. I will talk a little bit about throughout the night and, when you can start seeing results and little things you can do to put the rest of the night in place. But like I said, I'd say about 80% of the energy is at bedtime. So I'll talk about that first, and then at the end, I'll talk about, the rest of the night and kind of filling in those missing pieces so that they can sleep all night in bed, which is the goal. But if a toddler's not falling asleep well at the beginning of the night, if they're not comfortable sleeping, they're not going to be comfortable throughout the rest of the night. So it really does kind of set the stage for them and give them the ability to sleep by working on bedtime. So that's what I'll be talking about for most of the talk, but I will talk about the rest of the night at the end. So we get to the point, a toddler is ready, we feel comfortable, we've done all these little changes, which again are in the first part of the video, I've linked below, and then we're ready to start having them learn to fall asleep on their own, the parent be able to leave. Now at the end goal, most toddlers I work with, we want them to be able to say goodnight if it's bedtime and they go to bed. That's the end goal, and I work with clients over 2 weeks. As we get to that, usually there are small steps to get to that point. So we don't expect that at the beginning, and we make small gradual changes so they can gradually get more and more comfortable with that space and with that, ability to fall asleep. So it's a gradual process. So I want to talk through each step, and kind of how it looks is we do one change. It's a smaller step. It's not you're on your own, go to bed. It's a small step in that direction. Once they get used to it, I'd say one change, probably like 2 or 3 nights, and then we think, okay, how can we do the next change? How can we get them that much closer to being independent? So it is a gradual process, and I find it works better for toddlers, and it works better for parents too, because it gives them, it's just less of a shock, it's easier to manage, and they usually do better with it. I want to talk about the 3 main things that we usually discuss when we're talking about that one change we're going to do in that direction we want to help encourage more and more independence. So the first thing we always talk about is, okay, what is that step? What direction do we want them to go? And what boundary do we want them to learn, that when you say, bedtime is bedtime, or this is what's happening, what do we want them to learn and to listen to? So it's always involves some sort of boundary, some sort of push towards that direction. Different examples of a boundary or kind of a goal we make is, so say if a toddler is getting up frequently, up and out of bed, 7-8 times before they actually settle. Okay, maybe we want to push them to only be allowed to get out 2 times before they learn they have to be in bed. So how can we slowly move them toward that goal? It could be a boundary that we just want them to have more physical space from the parent. So if it's the case where the parent says, they need me to lie right beside them in bed with them, then okay, maybe we want that boundary to be, okay, you can lie in bed, I'll lie beside your bed. So it could be creating a physical distance between them. And it really kind of depends on the toddler and what's happening, and that will dictate, okay, how can we just gradually create more space or more boundaries? So it could be a physical boundary. It could be a physical boundary in terms of learning, mommy's going to be out in the hall, I'll come back and see you, but you have to learn to stay in bed on your own. So it could be a boundary that they have to learn to stay in bed while you're in the hall versus like being in the room with them. So it's always a discussion of what's one step in that direction of them learning that bedtime is bedtime and the rules around it, and what rule do we want to implement. And again, it doesn't have to be at the beginning, you're on your own in bed. We can do gradual rules and gradual space in that sense. So what is that space we're going to try to create, or what is that rule? With that, we want them to learn, when you ask them something, you want them to listen to it. The second discussion, the second thing we always talk about is, what kind of comfort can we introduce to them so that they're more willing to accept that boundary or that rule that we're making for them? So is there something we can do to make it more comfortable and make it easier for them, or more accepting of it, or protest it less? And there's a huge, there's so many different ideas for what we could do comfort-wise. It could be It could be a comfort in terms of an actual physical object. So I know with my son, he would be okay with staying in the bed if he had his Thomas train. So I would allow him to have it if he was going to stay in bed. So it could be something physical. He also used a little star projector that projects stars on the ceiling. So that could be something you could introduce as a way you can watch the stars, you can listen to music, you don't have to be alone, but I'm going to be, laying beside you, or I'm going to be out in the hall, or whatever that space is. With toddlers, I find with that you can use communication. So could it be, some toddlers, we've almost explained it to them before bed so they know what's happening. So being able to communicate opens up a lot of different options. It could be something to do with their imagination. I use their imagination to our advantage all the time, and it, having them in the sense of it, something providing them comfort through them, maybe having a story that's linked to comfort that makes them happy to stay in bed. One example and one book I love, it's called The Invisible String, where it teaches the child that they're connected to their parent through an invisible string. So it could be maybe introducing a storybook before bedtime and then using that as part of your comfort so that they are a little bit more comfortable with that boundary. It could be a story that you make up. So if your child, like my son, he always, I would say, oh, mommy used to be scared to lay in bed, but I had to do it. And that seems to work for him if he understands. It could be a completely made up story to do with a stuffed animal he has, or kind of anything. And it's a pretty big conversation with parents when we're deciding on the comfort, just because there's so many different options. It could be something like saying, I'll let you listen to, we've done a lot like music. Mommy's going to leave the room, but you can listen to this music. The only thing I would suggest is it's not something that's super stimulating. So if it's going to be like bright lights or music that's like winds them up, you kind of want to avoid that. But I'm definitely not against using props, and I use things at the beginning like that just to help them be more comfortable and accepting of it. Usually more near the end of the 2 weeks, we start phasing those things out. Because at the beginning it can be common if you introduce something to give them more comfort, it might make bedtime go longer. So it's not really ideal, some of the things to keep all the time, like saying listening to music before bed or while you're falling asleep, or having a toy train. So often we do it at the beginning just so they accept the rule a little bit easier. It's more comforting for them, and then you can kind of phase that out, and they do better with getting rid of it down the road once they're used to the pattern of this is bedtime and this is how it goes. So definitely at the beginning we introduce things that we might not stick, but to me, if it helps enforce that boundary just the first time, second time you do it, then that's something we can remove that it's a lot easier to remove that. So yeah, we always have the conversation of what could we do so that they will accept this change that we're going to do. And then the last part, and I'm going to give an example of a couple favorites after this, but that's, yeah, always, it's a balance between making a boundary but trying to provide comfort as you enforce it. And then the last part of the conversation really is, okay, so it's nice to have, provide some comfort for them, and you want to create this boundary, but usually we have to talk about what's going to happen when they don't listen. So when they say no, and when they, fight whatever it is you're trying to change, which will happen, what are we going to do when they don't do it? And I find that there's always a component of them not wanting to do it. And for me, the big thing I want to do is have the parent stick to whatever the change is, whatever that boundary is. Say you want your child to stay in bed while you're out in the hall. We have to stick to it so they learn that when you tell them, they need to listen. So the first time you do it is always the hardest, but that's the end goal. And if it's a smaller step, it's usually easier to stick to it and have them learn. So the question is, what are we going to do when they don't do that because we really want them to learn to stick to it. So we have to follow through with what we've decided. So usually there has to be some sort of kind of consequence for them not doing it. So say you want them to fall asleep beside you and you're going to be a little bit more space. So you'll have to repeat, it's bedtime, it's bedtime, it's bedtime, until they learn. You can provide the comfort, but you have to stick to it. In terms of consequences, it could be something as simple as you're not in your bed like I asked, I'm going to have to take away your Thomas train, or I'm going to have to turn up that music. If it's in terms of, say, you're leaving the room, it could be, I'm going to have to shut the door. So they need some sort of consequence to it, and that's always a discussion, is what do you think your child, what consequence will work for them? Sometimes they have to experience it. Like for my son, I would have to shut the door. He'd say, no. And I'd say, okay, it'll be open, but you stay in bed. So I think often experiencing what you're going to tell them you're going to do, and then they're usually more likely to accept the other option of, I'll stay in bed then if that's not going to happen. Or, I want that Thomas train, so I'll stick to it, because that option's better than the one of them shutting the door. And often what I do in terms of how you can phrase it to them is we'll say, okay, mommy's going to leave the room. They'll say, no. And say, okay, well, then would you want to listen to music while mommy leaves the room? That's your other option. And they'll say, okay, I'd rather do that. So sometimes phrasing it in a way where you were going to maybe give them music or comfort anyway, but phrasing it so that they're, so that it's like, oh, okay, I won, I got music now, but you want them to that's the best option, even though it was the one you were going to do. So sometimes we talk about how are we going to phrase it so they're like, okay, I'll accept that, and I don't want this worst thing. So there's always some sort of consequence. Okay, so I want to give an example of a technique that I use, and it has the boundaries, the comfort, and the consequence. The one that I usually do very often, and this is for a child who maybe wants the parent to sleep with them, doesn't want them out of the room. So what we do is we want to gradually work on them being able to be comfortable sleeping in their bed, or at least being alone in their bed at the beginning. So often what we'll do for a couple nights is to say, okay, the parent before bedtime say, I'm going to leave the room and I'll be back. If they protest it, okay, well, do you want to listen to music? Another thing I find is listening to audiobooks is a great kind of comfort that you can say, well, do you want to listen to this book? You stay in bed, mommy will be gone. That I find toddlers really love, and really helps them to accept that rule of leaving the room. Again, you don't want it too stimulating. My son used Winnie the Pooh, but you can find them on YouTube, Spotify. You can either put your phone, you don't want them seeing the screen, but just the sound. We used a Bluetooth speaker, so you can kind of say, well, you listen to the book, mommy's gonna go, I'll be back. And for a couple nights, just get them used to the idea that you're gonna be gone, you're there, and you'll come back. And then what you do is you do come back, maybe do that a few times, and then say, okay, time for bed, and do what you normally would do. So just getting them used to that routine of leaving without expecting them to sleep on their own can be helpful to get them just used to the idea of being in the room on their own. And then from there, we might say, okay, mommy's going to be in the hall. You can listen to your audiobook, but I'll be right out in the hall. And you can maybe call back to them and say, mommy's still here, you stay. And then again, if they're not going to do it, okay, the audiobook goes off, the door gets shut, or whatever it is that they're going to say, okay, never mind, I'll listen to it. Now with this, it does take bedtime a little bit longer because you're doing this, so we don't do it for too long. But when we first introduced the concept of leaving and coming back, maybe 2-3 times, leave for a minute or two. And then when you go to the spot where you're like, okay, they can go on their own, I'll be in the hall, that one might take longer. And that's the one, if that's our next boundary, you're going to be in the hall, they're going to be in their bed, you kind of have to stick to it. So even if it takes longer, it's okay. We want them to learn that they have to listen to that rule. Once they do, bedtime gets quicker and quicker, but at the beginning you want them to stick to it. So that's a few examples of how you can create a boundary, provide a comfort, but also have a consequence to it. And then from there, after we make maybe that step and they learn, okay, when you fall asleep, mommy's in the room, you might be able to maybe start turning off the audiobook, or removing things that might be taking bedtime longer. So with some clients, we'll say listen to the audiobook and then it's going to go off after 10 minutes, or listen to it before bed and then it's bedtime. And it's a little bit easier to enforce, like bedtime is bedtime, when they've been used to falling asleep in that room. So that's probably, I'd say, the most common thing that I do with toddlers who are having trouble falling asleep on their own and want the parent there. But it really depends on the toddler, because some just want the comfort of the parent. Others, it's more they're acting out at bedtime, so they're maybe misbehaving and they're not listening to the parent. And in that case, it might be a whole different strategy where our boundary is, okay, mommy is not going to respond to you, and ignoring them. So it really kind of depends. And again, every toddler's so different, but enforcing a boundary, trying to create comfort so they accept it, and then having a consequence is key if they're not going to. To make it go smoother, again, you can check out my first video, because there's a lot of things in the day you can do leading up to that change so they're more accepting of it. So that's something you can check out. And then as far as the nighttime, so what we usually do, the end goal is they can fall asleep on their own in the bed before bedtime. Once they start doing that, I do find nighttime wake-ups reduce. They're more comfortable sleeping on their own, and then naturally they just reduce. So if you're having a toddler who's also getting up frequently, wanting to come in your bed or waking you up, usually that resolves once, again, they learn to fall asleep on their own. If they are still waking up, usually I say if you can, direct them back to bed is ideal, because you want them to learn, you go back to bed and this is not, the time to be up. And I do find just directing them back to bed, even if it means having to kind of sit with them, that's fine. Again, once they feel more comfortable at bedtime, usually that goes away. But if you have to, while you're working on these goals at bedtime, I'd say the first week is all bedtime focused, and then in the night just trying to either direct them back, do what you need to do, get them to sleep. If they're overtired in the next day, your bedtime goals are going to be more difficult. So I don't really put too much pressure on changes in the night. If they're coming into bed with you, at some point we do want to start redirecting them back to their bed. Maybe not necessarily the first couple nights, but as, again, they get more comfortable with it, we will start directing them back. The toughest time is usually 4 a.m. on. That's when their sleep's lightest. That's when most parents report them wanting to come in bed with them. So at that point, like at the beginning, I usually say just let them sleep, but there does get to a point where we're like, okay, bedtime's going a little better, you have a little bit more energy, because really all these changes take energy and focus for you. So we don't have to do them all at once, but once bedtime's a little smoother, then we say, okay, now, or maybe it's the weekend, okay, now let's start redirecting them back and teaching them. So that's kind of a constant process, and I'd say more the second week is focused on getting them back into bed. The first week's like the bedtime changes. And one thing that I often start implementing into the second week, once the toddler is learning to fall asleep on their own in their bed, a Groclock works wonders for toddlers. And what it does is it gives visual cues for them to know, okay, bedtime is bedtime. And it's a great way for you to like press the button, the sun goes away, and bedtime is bedtime. So we often use it in the second week to just go with what we're already trying to teach them. Bedtime's bedtime. And then what it does is it helps them learn that when morning is and the sun comes up. So it really gives them those clear boundaries of when they can stay in bed. And once a toddler's comfortable falling asleep on their own, staying in their room with the clock, the Groclock can work amazing. And I have a whole video which I can link on how you can use the Groclock to help your child stay in bed, and especially if they're waking up really early in the morning and it's not quite morning but they don't know, it can really help enforce that when morning is, and they end up loving it, and then they can start sleeping into it. So I often use that into the second week. I don't introduce it at the beginning because there's too many other changes going on, but into the second week, once their bedtime's better, then we start creating these boundaries of bedtime and morning, and they do really, really well with it. So that's something you can check out in the video below to use kind of in conjunction. So I hope that helps give you kind of a sense of setting toddler boundaries at bedtime. I have an upcoming Q&A on YouTube, so if you have questions, and I have them weekly, if you have questions, you can stay connected. I think like, subscribe, and you can get notified so that when I have Q&As, if you have a specific question about your toddler and this is how they're behaving at bedtime, what technique might work for them, that's something you can reach out and ask, and I can answer on my Q&A. And you kind of stay connected that way. But I hope that gives you a sense of what you can do to help your little one fall asleep and stay asleep at night. And one thing I will say is that it is the first night you do it is hard for parents. Setting those boundaries, sticking to them is really hard the first night. Once you can get through it, you'd be amazed how toddlers respond and they listen. And so always the first time, I always give hands-on support, because I know I've seen it enough times that once they can get through it, it's going to be so much easier. So keep that in mind when you're going to do a change. If you stick to it, as hard as it is, they will learn. But my goal is really to make the changes smaller so that it's easier to stick to them and easier on your child. So if you can think of a plan of, okay, I want them to either stay in bed and I'll lay beside them, or I want them to stay while I just leave the room, or I want them to stay and I'll be in the hall. You can break it up into steps that way, because the number one thing is sticking to it, and if it's smaller, it's easier to stick to. So that's something to keep in mind, is once we decide on the change, we want to make it as comfortable as we can. We do all the daytime things that can help the change, and then we stick to it because we feel confident. We're like, okay, this is the right thing to do. And having a toddler who listens at bedtime and is happy at bedtime is so worth a night or two of them, of it being difficult, because their sleep gets better, their nights get better, and this, I think, is to me more long term, because if a toddler listens at bedtime, they're always going to be a good sleeper. If we use things like, oh, I'll give you a cookie in the morning, or I'll reward you in some way, those don't stick long term. So for me, teaching them to listen at bedtime is the best long term strategy, and that's my goal, is to gradually do that and have them listen. And I don't really ever use kind of reward. People ask about reward charts or things that they can kind of reward the child with, and I don't really ever do that. I do comfort things to help ease, but at the end of the day, we want some sort of component where they're learning and they're listening. So I hope that helps. If you have any younger toddlers that are still in the crib, or younger infants, stay tuned as well. This is really more towards toddlers who are kind of in a toddler bed you can communicate with, but younger toddlers is always something I'm happy to talk about, and you can again stay tuned for Q&As, or stay tuned on my channel for more videos. I'm going to be doing infant sleep series next, because I've been talking about toddlers for a long time and I want to talk about infants, so stay tuned for that, and I hope that helps. So bye-bye and happy sleeping.